In the comments section of my most recent Mr. D Goes to Washington video, someone too afraid to use their own name commented, "There is no privilege with being white. There is only privilege in being born into a wealthy family. The only distinction in life that matters is money, not the color of your skin or your sex/gender." I don't think our anonymous friend is right about white privilege, but I don't think he's entirely wrong either. He just hasn't for some reason, and I can't imagine what that reason could possibly be. He hasn't made the connection between the color of a person's skin and their inability to acquire wealth in America for the last 400 years. Wealth is that money thing our anonymous friend rightly thinks is so important. For nearly 250 years, black people had their wages stolen from them, and that theft occurred on top of being forced by threat of violence or even death to work back-breaking jobs they would never have otherwise chosen. That allowed slave owners to acquire tremendous wealth, which they then passed on to their heirs, giving future generations yet another leg up. Slave owners didn't completely earn this wealth. They stole much of it, and in the most despicable way. But they got their money, and they passed it on to future generations. When slavery ended, blacks were hardly better off. In much of the country, they were absolutely loathed and still seen as less than human by large majorities of the population, and not just in the South. That made it hard to get work. When blacks couldn't find work, they were often arrested for vagrancy and put on chain gangs, once again becoming de facto slaves. Seems that 13th Amendment had a little loophole. Others were given the opportunity to work a portion of their former slave owners' land in exchange for housing and a truly pathetic wage, which was often not even paid. Not to worry, though. These former slaves could always appeal to local, unbiased law enforcement to correct the injustice, or at least be beaten nearly half to death for trying. These various scenarios continued to keep blacks from acquiring wealth. That money thing our anonymous friend talked about. One of the main ways people acquire wealth is by purchasing a home or some other property which appreciates in value over time. So, of course, the federal government had to create a policy to keep blacks from that avenue of wealth creation as well. That policy was called redlining, and Adam Ruins Everything has a great video on that subject I'll link to in the description. To get a home, blacks often had to purchase a home directly from the seller, and usually at a ridiculous interest rate with equally ridiculous terms. One late payment often meant foreclosure and a complete loss of equity, at which point the owner would then sell the house to another black buyer under the same terms and conditions. That's a pretty good scam. Redlining also meant that blacks were locked out of better neighborhoods and, more importantly, better schools. Education is, of course, another way for people to move up and out of poverty. Basic segregation kept most blacks from getting a better education, but redlining definitely helped keep them down, as did outright bans on black students at many of America's most prestigious colleges and universities. This was compounded by the fact that K-12 schools were largely funded by property taxes. Many still are. So living in a poor neighborhood meant, and often still means, children in those neighborhoods get a lower quality education. That also limits their ability to acquire wealth. Tilting the playing field so dramatically against one group means that other groups with no such burden, will necessarily benefit as there is greatly reduced competition, and that's just one factor. The wealth acquired also by people 300 years ago didn't just disappear when those people died. It was passed on and passed on again, giving each succeeding generation of those unburdened by such impediments an undeniable advantage, which remains today. Opportunities to acquire wealth, which were available to my father and grandfather, were not available to the father and grandfather of my black friend Steve. So while wealth is indeed the most dramatic and life-changing advantage of privilege, being blind to the nearly endless roadblocks which have kept blacks from acquiring wealth is beyond ignorant. It's willfully ignorant. But it adds to the belief of those so unburdened that they are where they are because they're simply better, smarter, more resourceful, harder working, when in essence, they were simply born on third base and can't stop bragging about hitting that triple.
an anonymous, really an anonymous